Now, there are some other people who are here for the first time whom I don't know yet, and it's a great way to get to know people. You ask them what their name is so I can introduce them to you. But I'm going to do that. I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to have them come up to the microphone and tell all of you who they are.
Hi, good morning. My name is Chris Jenick. I'm active duty U.S. Navy out at Point Mugu. Still have a bunch of friends over there in Saudi right now, so my unit is currently deployed over there, so glad to be here. Thank you.
I'm Dennis Hoffman from Ventura, Vice President of Vietnam Vets Motorcycle Club. Good friend of Shad's, good brother. Thank you all.
And then we have the two Larrys who are here from Lompoc over here. So you can say my name's Larry and my other brother's name is Larry, but they're both named Larry. Larry and Larry, stand up. Now, did we miss anybody? Anybody from Vietnam who didn't get introduced? Welcome back. Welcome home. I will straighten my tie here a little bit for the benefit of the tens of thousands who watch this over television. I don't know if there are tens of thousands out there, but I know that my friend Eunice Smith is watching this, and our neighbor Edward Fenwick is watching it. He's not watching it now because it's not on now. It won't be on till this evening. But he and his wife Marie will be watching this, and their son Felix and their daughter Alice. They'll all be watching. Then I met a woman over at the flower shop on Milpas yesterday, and she said she watches it. So I bought her a flower. I mean, it's kind of nice. I'm not going to take. I mean, I could make a living out of telling little stories like this, but it wouldn't pay me nearly as well as being a University of California professor with tenure. But I don't want to take. I don't want to take any more time from the session today because if my heart's beating kind of fast right now. I'm not nervous. Legs are steady and strong, but I'm excited. I'm excited because really the person who introduced me to the Vietnam War topic in a way that became accessible for this campus is our guest today. And he has spoken to this class over the years more frequently than anybody else. He was the first vet to speak to the class when the class was organized back in 1979. We figured coming in here this morning that when he and I were up here doing this, some of you were probably about 5 or 6 or 7 years old. So we've been at this for some time. His name is Shad Meshad. Shad Meshad. You spell the last name M-E-S-H-A-D. And you spell the first name S-H-A-D. You leave off the M-E first time through. It's Shad Meshad. Shad and I was responsible for organizing a conference on the Vietnam War that was supposed to be about a 4-day kind of thing that Mrs. Eula Laux, who I think is watching this today or tonight, sort of sponsored. And because we didn't, we had experts who could talk to us about military policy and the philosophy of the United States in getting involved in Vietnam, but we had no Vietnam vets. Shad was the first Vietnam vet that I met in a way that was a significant encounter for me. And when I met Shad, I learned that there's an awful lot more to the Vietnam War than can be written down in the history books. There's a lot more to the Vietnam War that can be put down in the manuals about military strategy. Indeed, when I say indeed because I learned how to talk that way too, but it's just enough to say in fact, I think. I got my perspective on the Vietnam War by listening carefully to what Shad Meshad was talking about and by observing closely and carefully what his life became about after he came back from the Vietnam War. Now, Wilson Hubbell up here has has heard me say this before, but I have referred to Shad as Mr. Vietnam. And by that I mean that he's been involved in all of it. He is the co-founder, along with Bill Mahidi, of the Veterans Outreach Program. And the Veterans Outreach Program is the predecessor institution to the vet centers around the country. The vet centers happened because Shad went before the Congressional Committee way back in, I don't know, 1978 or 79, and convinced Congress that the vet center program ought to be funded. It was Shad who did the talking then. It was also Bill who did the writing of that proposal, but they worked on that together. When it came time for there to be a national salute to the Vietnam veterans, there again Shad was in, not just in the middle of it, but the leader of it, one of the leaders of it. He was there in Washington when the memorial was dedicated in 1982. He has probably met and counseled more Vietnam vets than any other human being, and he's a Vietnam vet himself, having served 12 years in Vietnam as a psychology officer. And his life since he went to Vietnam has been Vietnam. He is currently the executive director of the Vietnam Veterans Aid Foundation in Los Angeles, after having served as the West Coast, I'm getting some of this language not quite right, but the director of the Veterans Outreach Program. On the first trip that Vietnam veterans made to the Soviet Union to meet with vets from the Afghan War, of course there was Shad leading that delegation. When the New York Times article, the first article that came out about that, was published, it was about Shad and the encounters that he had had with Soviet vets. When the vets came to this country, the vets from the Soviet Union, to meet up with American vets in this land, again it was Shad who organized that, who met those people. And he continues to do it, to this day. There would not be a class of this kind of dimensions or with this perspective at UCSB had it not been for Shad Meshad. Well, I said I was not going to take time from his presentation to make a long introduction, but I'm deliberately cutting this short because one of the keys to my success is to try to see the world through the eyes of Shad Meshad. I'm very pleased today to present him as the co-founder of this class. Please welcome Shad Meshad.
Thanks for having me here today. It's 12 years have gone by, and as I look out among all the individuals out there, I always try to think of, the main thing is not to talk to you people, even though you have to, and really not to lecture you, but to share. And the thing that happened 14 years ago, almost to the month, was a long journey up to Santa Barbara to, quote, go to a dialogue at a think tank, which was called the Hutchins Center here in in Santa Barbara. I'm kind of brainwashed about L.A. Just for the records, for those of you that were snickering, I would too. If I'd have spent 12 years in Vietnam, you wouldn't see me here today. But I appreciate that. 12 months was long enough. It was like 20 years, actually. So in a way, it was 12 years, I guess. But the journey here really started through Dr. Walter Capps. And Walter, as we were sitting down over breakfast this morning, because over the years, whenever he asked me to come up and speak to the class, we have breakfast. We go sort of through a ritual about the years. I can remember even before the class started, about sitting down before the first class of 50 students over in one of the little classrooms over there, and 155 was born. And we were sitting down thinking of all the dialogue that had went on with the Hutchins Center, which was a think tank. And what they do, they've had all these national experts talking about our war, and political scientists, historians, whatever, talking about the Vietnam War. And Walter, believe you all know it. He knows what he's doing, whether he's telling a joke or whatever. He was very, very specific and distinct about what he was doing, and he wanted to contrast what people were saying about the war, and he wanted those that had participated in war to comment unquote, the experts. And the thing that made that happen was not just putting us into this bull ring like you put cockfighters or whatever in there, but what he did was he asked in front of everybody, and I'll never forget the moment across this table. It was like a Camp David, this encounter session up on top of Montecito and this mega $1 million mansion where they used to host these things. And he looked into my eyes and said, "Teach us the war." And I never forgot that. It's an emotional thing for me to say because no one in the 7 years that I had been back from Vietnam and working the streets of Los Angeles, I felt like a garbage worker. I used to work in what we call the sewer, which was Los Angeles, working the streets. East L.A., Watts, Venice Beach, the bad areas, not the real pretty areas. And sort of on recon with were Vietnam veterans who had just recently, particularly in the early 70s, had come back from Vietnam and were hiding from America. And it was the first time in my life that someone asked me to teach, because until that point, for 6 or 7 years, I only worked with the post-shit of war. And I want you to remember that. I'm not going to give you any fancy terms today. I think I'm regressing, Walter, because I remember when I first came to the center, I could only speak 4-letter words. I worked the street so much that every other word was a 4-letter word because that was the language. And I don't want us to forget, because basically I came out of this sewer and someone asked me to teach them about something, and particularly about the war, which particularly at that time the country was still in tremendous denial and in pain, not just the veterans, the whole country. And if anything, and if anybody needs to be thanked for that, it's Walter Capps for giving me the opportunity to share. And I'll never forget, when I started, I don't think I could stop. I was supposed to be on for 30 minutes amongst all these world-renowned political scientists, and we went 2 more days, myself and another Vietnam vet who had lost his arm and shoulder in Vietnam, and we didn't stop. And the first day, I don't think anyone really asked us one question. By the second day, I think they realized we were just human beings. We were just a little pissed off, and we were tired of being pissed on. And that was about where we were at that time, and that was 14 years ago. Not a long time ago. In some ways, it seems like yesterday every time I make the drive up here and I look up on that hill, wherever that mansion was, and it sort of grounds me as to what we're doing today. So I don't know if I'm going to teach you anything, but I'm going to take you through a journey, and I'm going to bring you up to the future, because to me, when you walk out of here today, it's what you do in the future that counts, not what was said today per se, or what happened in the past. I want you to really take it, because what you have just gone through in the last 2 months, regardless of whether it was right or wrong and how beautiful or wondrous it looks and all the red, white, and blue, there's still shit that comes after this type of incident. And I want you to be as aware as possible and to be ready the rest of your life, because it probably won't be the last war, and it probably won't be this clean and this quick. I got involved in this stuff because I know a lot of my brothers here, a lot of them have never really heard me tell my story, so I'm going to take a few minutes, story time. And I was sitting in a room about 1/10 this size in ROTC. I was about 18 years old, 19, and during a period 25 years ago, it was mandatory. We were right in the middle of the longest and the most intense, confusing war of our history, Vietnam. And just like many of you might have been concerned, particularly with this war in the Middle East, about your status, it was a little different from us, but I'm not saying you weren't anxious about whether you were going to go or what you were going to do, or if we were going to be spending more than 7 months or whatever, 7 years in the Middle East. And I'm not saying that we're out of there, but the anxiety was tremendous. And I remember a couple of moments, so if we can freeze frame, I'll tell you as quick as I can how I got to at least getting back to America. And it took a process of leaving. And when I first left America, was in a classroom and it was Guerrilla Warfare 1. And it was taught by a 6'2" Green Beret named Sergeant Connolly, the biggest, baddest, meanest, most handsome, romantic killer I ever met in my life. Could drink and do all the other things that men do, the whole school under the table, and he lets you know it without saying it. And in that class, it was my first class in guerrilla warfare, and we were all like, hey, we're going to do it because ours is a guerrilla war, and we're going to learn how to be guerrillas, was a 5-minute Super 8 film. And I've told this little story probably 1,000 times, particularly to students, but it sort of sets the thing off. I was just a student like you, and he walked in and he asked everyone to sit down. In fact, he didn't say ladies and gentlemen, he said ladies, please have your seat. And there's 33 young, studly men that sat down on these little chairs and being called ladies by, Rambo of that time. And we're sitting there, and he shuts all the windows and turns on the film. And it was a 5-minute color Super 8 film, sort of scratchy, whatever, but very distinct. And it was a sweep through a village with yours truly, Sergeant Connolly, walking through after they had just swept a village. And there were about 10 or 12 bodies that were on. You could still see the smoke or whatever had happened. You could just sort of visualize it. And you saw them and the troops coming in, stripping these Vietnamese down, gooks as he called it, and they were stripping them down, taking identification, taking knives, sticking it back through them, making sure everyone was dead. A couple of guys were cutting off body parts, and it kept going and going and going. The film got closer, and you could see Donnelly, back on the screen. He was sort of smiling like, this is, condoning this, and it was like an atrocity I'd never seen in my life. And then all of a sudden it ended, and it is flickering with white. And when I turned around, there were about 29 of the individuals in the class who were outside throwing up. And there was just a few of us sitting up in the front row. Most of us were kind of down like this, like, what was this? And Donnelly walked up to the microphone, in, little room, and he just looked at us, and he said, this is introductory course into guerrilla warfare, and the 4 of you that are sitting in this room, maybe one of you will make it alive. The rest of them are dead. Welcome to Vietnam. And that was the end of the class. It was about 7 minutes long. And I remember getting up. I can even feel it now, and it's 25 years ago, and sort of walking out of the room. And people everybody had disappeared. It was like somebody had thrown a million rattlesnakes in the room. People had just ran, and we sat there, and it was really, we couldn't even talk. We were just traumatized. And from that point, Disneyland, for me, became over, regardless of whether this was a right or wrong war. And at that point, in the mid-'60s, Vietnam was a right war, just like this war in the Middle East was correct. But this was the deed of a warrior. These were the things, these were the tools that I was supposed to learn. And I was confused. Probably as confusing as what I just shared with you. From that moment on, I looked at everything quite differently. I completed my training. I decided that if anything, rather than to be on the other end of that squad that had swept through that village, I better know my shit. I better know it well. I went infantry. I went airborne. I did all these things, but one lucky thing happened to me, and it was probably the first sign from God, for those of you that believe in God, was that I got a deferment from graduate school after getting my lieutenant bars after graduating from college, and I got to go to graduate school. And through that process, I was able to sit back as my class went through, and in the next 3 years, I got a grace period of watching the war as a graduate student, as a commissioned reserve officer, and watching the war from 65 to 68, 69. And those were the years that it changed drastically. And it was even more confusing being trained for this, being on the sidelines, and waiting and wondering if this was going to end or if I was going to have to participate. And during that period, I lost 2 high school friends. I lost 2 fraternity brothers, just in this 3.5-year period. And the war, even though I hadn't tasted it yet, got closer and closer. And in '69, when I graduated, God spoke to me again. I got a degree in psychiatric social work, psychology, and I was able to go from infantry to medical service corps, and I was become a, quote, psych officer because I was a professional. I was 23 years old, probably many of you there, and all of a sudden I went from a lieutenant infantry to captain in the medical service corps. And believe me, for the infantrymen that are here and the grunts, that was like, you know, that was like calling the war off before it started. I thought, well, I'm safe. And I was only safe from that aspect of the war. And the year going into service, I started having guilt because of the death of classmates and the fact that I was slipping the most important event in my life and probably in the country. At that time, it seemed that way. And to make a long story short, after a year going through what a lot of us do about guilt, you know, it's like doing something you shouldn't have done, or you didn't do something you should have done. And I volunteered to go because of the guilt and felt like I had to see the most controversial event that I'll ever probably live through in my life. And I felt that way then, probably still do now. And I went to Vietnam, January 1970. And just to share a few stories there, it was really the most incredible year of my life. And I'm sure that many Vietnam veterans even here will say that. I'm not saying it was the happiest year of my life, because in most ways it was probably the saddest and the most painful. I know that. But and yet, through all that pain, molded what I know today as myself, whatever you want to call me, Shad, Mad, the Madman. I've had a lot of nicknames. I became whatever because of hitting the bottom of the ocean and getting lost. I'm sure as Bill Mahidi said, or you've heard Walter say, into the heart of darkness. Total darkness and total isolation and total suffering from being lost into that. And during that year, I had a unique assignment. It was exciting, particularly being in a life and death situation. I know many of you do. If you've ridden your bicycle around this campus, it's probably that exhilarating. Or if you're a pedestrian trying to dodge those people. Or if you ride a motorcycle. And sometimes you just sit on the throttle and you just have that vibration going through you, and you're just barreling through space at 100 miles an hour, you know, like a projectile, and you just feel invincible, almost like an M16 round or whatever, that, you know, you're just infallible and all-powerful. And yet it's just that racer's edge. You've had it before, whether it's skiing or something, where you just feel so invincible. And I felt that way, particularly I had a good introduction into Vietnam as far as getting in alive and the people I met. And my assignment was to be a flying psych officer. I flew into units as a young 24-year-old captain at that time, in and out of units throughout the entire country, but initially 1 and 2 Corps. I was based out of a MASH hospital in Da Nang, and I flew out of that area for most of the year, for 9 months. And during that period, I flew into stand-down areas, I flew into fire bases, and I listened to stories of 18-year-olds. Some as young as 17, but most were 18, 19-year-olds that were just high school graduates. They were in a situation, particularly by the time I got there, that wasn't popular. It definitely was not a Desert Storm, Desert Shield operation. There wasn't any red flags. By the time I hit Vietnam, you know, in the middle of my tour, even the first third of my tour, Kent State had happened. I'm watching, you know, the National Guard shoot students like yourself that were protesting, just all types of things. And the fact that, you know, once you got over there, you were almost getting afraid to go back, because after the first week you start changing. You see how things are. You see what the war was really about and not what you see on the news. Even in the reporting today, as sophisticated it is and current, you know, it can be biased. And it was really biased during our war, and the body counts and all these things. And my journey took off. And 1 minute I'd be sitting in a hooch in the middle of a fire base listening to a kid that was talking about his Dear John letter from his girlfriend from UCSB, who decided that she was now with the peace movement and she could no longer justify her boyfriend being in Vietnam, killing and whatever, just assuming from all the press and everything that that's what he was doing. And if he was doing that, assuming that he had a choice, and all this assuming, and you've heard about the word assume, but it was terrible. And yet, all you had over there was yourself and whatever contact you had with the world. We used to call it the world. It was like heaven, paradise. And that journey through there was just fascinating. As you sit there, when you're totally stripped down, as if I could take someone in here and torture you for a week, not hurt you bad, but strip you down, beat you up, isolate you, do the things or whatever, and then bring someone in that wants to listen to you. You probably talk from your heart more than you would today, trying to look good, you know how we do or whatever, sort of hide behind our look, our makeup, our hairstyle, our jerseys or whatever. And I really got to hear the spirit for the first time in my life of young men and women, because we had women there also. And it was beautiful. Probably the greatest journey for me in Vietnam was integrity. And as I said earlier, and I'll tie that in, it wasn't until years later that someone believed in me and said, I want to know the real story. Teaches. And but here we are several years before that moment, and I'm learning, just like you might be learning from this class, I was learning from those grunts, the ones sitting behind me today that had to walk through Hell's Half Acre day in and day out with no support from the leadership, no support from the president, no support probably in most cases from their families because of the confusion, and really just no support except from the other individuals that were walking the sewer, walking through the sewer, because that's when you get close. You know, walk a mile with someone, go through a horrifying event with someone, and the brotherhood starts immediately. There are no words. There's nothing you can say. You can't buy. It's not, hey, go for a ride in my car. I'll take you to the nearest star. Whatever. It's just strictly you spiritually. And if anything I can say, and I don't know if I've ever said it in this class, is you get in touch with your spirit. And the one thing that I've shared with Vietnam veterans through the years is don't lose your spirit because it's sacred. No matter how shit you feel, how deep you feel in the mire of this sewer, you are definitely the future, and today are the philosopher kings. And you need to speak and talk. And I found that out through my enabler and through this wonderful man here in a magic moment in 1977. But what I was finding out, I didn't have a chance to process it. It was that I was learning. And there were moments, horrific moments, that I remember, but particularly a moment when a young 21-year-old who was on his second tour trying to get rank and went over there, who was a supply officer, and I probably told this story, I'll never forget, and he was starting to just sit and shake and cry. And he was a perfect career soldier working his way up through rank, second tour, and his commanding officer sent him to me to see and find out why he was just going through these shakes and crying and wouldn't talk. And I saw this individual over at the MASH hospital several times. And I kept saying, you know, Billy, Sergeant Williams, whatever, you've got to share something. The CO, I mean, what could happen if you freeze up, even though you're not in combat, is you could be court-martialed for not performing your duty. And you're in supply, and these soldiers need supplies, and you're not functioning. And he'd go back, and he'd try, and he'd just break down, and he'd become petrified. They'd bring him back over to the hospital. And one day I noticed in his fatigues, he had this envelope. And I said, is this a letter? You know, I'd at least gotten out of him that he was married, been married a couple of years. And I said, what is, you know, as a therapist trying to draw out what's going on, do you hear from your wife? And he just sort of looked down, and tears started coming out of his face, and he sort of looked down at his uniform. And I said, may I see the letter? And he just sort of grabbed it like this, like I was going to take a grenade off and pull the pin. And then he just broke down, buried his head in his lap, and handed me the envelope. And it was very heavy. It was filled with pictures. And it was a letter. I didn't look at the pictures first. I read the letter, and it was a hate letter from his wife, Susie. And she was about 19, 20 years old. And the letter, I thought, wow, just reading the letter. And she kept saying, take this, shove this, this is what you get. This is what you get for leaving me, on and on and on and on. And I just was so afraid. And I remember turning up the pictures, and they were Polaroids. You know how stiff, heavy Polaroid pictures are. You can imagine 20 years ago. And the pictures were Susie making love in 8 different positions with his best friend. And each one of them was her looking up, giving them the royal salute, saying, "Fuck you very much." And I remember shaking, almost in sync with him, and looking at him with no words to say. And he looked up and he said, "All I need is 1 day emergency leave." That was the first time he spoke clearly. Looked at me like a ranger that he'd been in combat. He says, "I need 1 day to go back and fix this." And I knew what he meant. And it was a major dilemma, because in no psychiatric textbook, whether through the university or through the military, had an answer to this man's dilemma. And believe me, I really had no answer. The bottom line was that this individual, against my recommendation, was given, because his CO's anger about this was to have him go back and waste his best friend. That was the type of leadership we had. That was the smart move because of the emotions. And God only knows what happened. I almost got court-martialed fighting that, because that was not appropriate. Not that I had anything appropriate to say. But these were the type dilemmas that I experienced through that tour of duty. I also met a young kid from Los Angeles, never knowing that me, a Southerner from the Southeast, would end up in L.A. a year later, but talking to this kid from East L.A. who was a point man. All he did was point and recon, point and recon. He was on his second tour, and they came to me and said, "Sir, something's wrong. Every time we send this guy out, particularly with the recon unit, they never come back, and he comes back. And we've got an unusual thing. We've had the CIA, which is a CID in the military, that has suspected that he was offing the patrols that were going out with him." He was a 19-year-old recon kid, supposed to be the best. Could go like a snake, hit the jungles, and find Charlie, the enemy, could bring that back. But after 2 tours where they were sending him, there wasn't much activity. And he had become so accustomed to killing, so hooked on killing, that the units that were sent out to follow his point would set up in the night. He was addicted to squeezing off rounds, and he would literally kill the unit in the silence of the night. And he didn't feel bad about it. And I was supposed to work with this individual in about a 30-minute session. Yeah, it was definitely a catch-22. These are some of the extreme stories of Vietnam, all the way to the doctors and nurses that had to be both female, had to be officers, the women. They had to be mothers, they had to be nurses, they had to be doctors, and they had to be asexual as far as the military was concerned. And it was very difficult to handle all those roles. And I'd sit up in evenings when I worked the trauma center, triage in the MASH hospital, and listen to the stories and the pain, and watch 21, 22-year-old women that had their RN degree, that had went in to serve their country, start getting old very rapidly and very fast, and being drained, and having all these different roles to have to play, and being caught up in what was happening, and having to treat the enemy, the POWs that we took in. We gave them first-class treatment. They'd have to do all these things. Probably the most traumatic evening of my life, because I had several roles too. I don't think I compete with the nurses, but my first night on duty as the administrative officer, after, quote, 1900 hours, which is 7 p.m., a new junior officer would have to take over the hospital. And I'll never forget, it was my 3rd week in country, and I had to sit and wait in case there were mass casualties, because the war was fought in darkness. It was fought at night for the most part. And my first AOD, I'm sitting back in the commanding officer's chair in the MASH hospital, thinking, wow, you know, hope everything's cool tonight. You know, all I got to do is get to 7 a.m. in the morning, and, you know, I don't have to do this for another 3 weeks. And, you know, I'm the psych officer. I don't do the blood and gut stuff. You know, I'm not too good with blood and plasma and stuff. You know, I had enough trouble training through my medical service corps when we had to stick a dead pig and find an artery in each other. Most of us fainted trying to take blood from each other in our basic medical training. And here I am sitting here in a war zone as the administrative officer waiting for possible mass casualties. And what can I tell you? Mass casualties. 2200, 10 p.m. Red Board 2, this is Whiskey 3. We got heavy casualties coming in past Marble Mountain. We've got Marines. We've got the 101st Screaming Eagles. It's a combined Marine Army operation. They got hit, ambushed by an NVA battalion, and the casualties will be in 15 minutes. I'll never forget, it was like the longest 15 minutes of my life. I prayed like it wouldn't come, and I can remember everything sort of in slow motion. If you've watched MASH before, you know, you get up on the horns, you call the surgeons, you call the oral surgeons, you call the nurses. Who's ever on emergency call that night has to be ready. You got to call the blood bank to make sure we've got enough blood. If we don't have enough blood plasma, we've got to call the Marine base, the Naval base, the Sanctuary, which was a hospital ship. We had to find blood because, you know, we're probably going to go through 100 pints, maybe 200 pints that night. Maybe we only had 100 pints. And that doesn't mean we have 2 or 3 pints of your kind of blood. So, you know, it was like, hey, if you're bleeding to death, you can't just stick anything in there. And sure enough, we had everybody up, and I'm sitting here, a nervous wreck, not knowing what's going to happen. You got the helo pad out in the middle of darkness, and all of a sudden, I'll never forget the noise. It's just this, just got louder and louder and louder. I'll never forget that concussion sound, and it's like they're hovering 5 and 6 helicopters over. And, you know, these Quonset huts are just shaking like this, and this noise is pounding. Everything is shaking, our hearts or whatever. And I remember the general surgeon who had been through this sort of grabbed my arm and said, just hang on, just do what I tell you, you're going to be all right. And I'm the one in charge, but he's the surgeon. And I'm like this, and I'm like, my knees are getting weak. I never fainted in my life, you know. Here it is, you know, this is Super Bowl Sunday for me, you know, and I'm on, you know, whatever, and I see everybody ready. You could see the newbies like me and some of the old nurses, and they're all ready, but we're talking 35 casualties they're talking about. And sure enough, like in slow motion, I'll never forget, you hear one chopper land, and we had these gurneys on wheels that ran out into the darkness, and they would load 5 and 6 bodies of GIs. They'd just pitch them, and you could hear them slamming and crawling and picking up body parts and putting it on the gurney. And then we had swinging doors from the helo pad, and the doors blow open, and boom, there's just bodies stacked like a wild shopping spree, like you see tables of clothes that were bodies, uniforms, no uniforms, body parts, and they were taking the gurneys and dumping them like you do cement or bricks onto the floor right in front of triage, and our job was to start diving in and sorting through the bodies, and they kept coming, gurney after gurney. We had 35 18, 19-year-olds stacked as this high with 35 bodies sorting through legs and arms and people screaming. It was this most horrifying thing, and my knees kept buckling, and I kept getting slapped in the face by this Colonel Whitney, it was my roommate next door, you know, hooch mate or whatever, and he just kept popping me. I mean, he kept slapping me, and he kept saying, go to the ones that don't scream. The ones that scream the loudest you tend to go to. It's like a screaming baby, you know, and yet those that were screaming the loudest probably were less serious, and those that weren't screaming were dying. And I would get confused, and I remember wading through and taking with the medics and throwing the bodies up on the thing and trying to go through in IVs or whatever. And I was trying to remember my medical service training about tracheotomies. I don't know if any of you have ever had one or had to give one. And I'm sitting there and I'm looking, and they were doing tracheotomies where you cut the air passages in the throat. And I'm sitting here and my knees are buckling. I'm crawling on the floor with these guys. I've got guys grabbing me like octopuses around the arm, screaming, tell Susie goodbye, tell my mother this, that. This one Marine just slid me over, and I looked down. He had no legs, and one arm pulls me over, and I couldn't get his arm off. And we're sitting there trying to deal with him. I'm trying to work with this other nurse. It was just as crazy as I'm talking right now. And that went on from 10:15 to 7 a.m. in the morning. And I sat there, and out of the 35, only 10 were alive by the end of the evening that made it through the night. I had to bag, strip, and take the dog tags. If you ever see a real dog tag, it has a little niche in it. You have to hook that up into the jaw, lock the palate in before rigor mortis set in. We put them in a bag, and we put them in a steel box outside. We had like 25 young kids that had died anywhere from 1 hour to 1 minute ago, and we were trying to go through. And all I remember is this whirling through, blood everywhere, people going into emergency surgery, guys waiting and dying, waiting because there was just so much you could do. And then I remember it ending. And it was just shut off like that. And I remember someone grabbing me and saying, "You can go back to your hooch now." And it was like 7 a.m. And I was just thinking of all these different faces, and had I put all their belongings in a one sealed bag, notified next to kin notice to go to Saigon, had done all this right. I was like trying to do everything to stay unfocused on the faces and the looks of these guys as they looked into my eyes. And I went back to my room just numb, and I laid down, and I was out. And about an hour later, it seemed like forever, one of these medics came down and said, "Captain Meshad, you've got to get up. We're missing the ID on this red-headed kid." He was a captain who was going home the next day or whatever. I remembered him, and apparently I was so fixated on this guy because I thought he was talking to me, and the back of his head was blown off during the night. He was dead. That I remembered it, and through that I didn't take his identification off of me. And when I looked down, I noticed in my fatigues, which I had crashed in, I had his identification. They couldn't identify him. I had to go back to the Connex with 25 stinking bodies in rubber bags, find him, and make sure I identified him, put the identification back in. And it was like the horror was true, because when I laid down, it was like a bad dream. It's like when you wake up. And I came back, and I was probably never the same from that. I think I finally got in touch with a lot of things. Humility, helplessness. We're all human. I think we've all had those moments. Whatever machismo I thought I was as a great little state quarterback in high school coming from the South, I mean, I was stripped of everything, and I was starting to lose God because I was trying to realize that. And through all of this journey and seeing all the dead babies and people and GIs, whatever came in, I sort of bled my way out of Vietnam. And at the very end, I was in an accident. I almost felt good about it. It was almost one of those things like, man, I really need something physical to happen to me, because I couldn't imagine the pain I was in and what I'd seen, and trying to counsel people in situations like I described that were just innumerable. There was no rhyme or reason to anything. And I came home, I'll never forget, in the San Francisco airport, and there were 500-600 Berkeley students waiting as if they were a VC ambush patrol, waiting for the buses as we came from Travis, throwing Molotov cocktails at the buses. And we were in steel cage buses. I couldn't understand. I was just waiting for an embrace, a hug. I had like 100 stitches in my head, a back brace, a neck brace. I wouldn't even come home early. I just wanted to come home and see, quote, the world, this beautiful place that we live in. And here I am looking at students the age of the men and women that I worked with in Vietnam, trying to tear into me and our bus and shouting and calling us every name in the world. And I never forget that. And they followed us all the way into San Francisco, and then the whole night of processing out, and then trying to catch a plane home for Christmas Day, 1970. And I'll never forget. And I don't want you to forget. I don't want to forget because I don't want it to ever happen, and I don't think it will. But if we forget, it'll happen. But there were 3,000 GIs laying on the floor like lizards at San Francisco Air Force Base, San Francisco Airport. And we had a Christmas drop, a week to 2 weeks Christmas drop from the war. It was like the first threat that we might end this war, and we couldn't get an airplane home. We were like fourth-rate citizens because it was Christmas Eve. And if you don't have your reservation, you're standby, and everybody's flying. I mean, we're competing against the students, and we were afraid of you folks because students were like death. When I say you folks, I mean students 18, 19. And it was horrifying. And then they wouldn't allow a couple of, I guess my last act of horror was the fact that there was this beautiful blonde ticket agent that wouldn't allow 2 black combat vets on an airplane because they were inebriated. inebriated. I mean, they had a few drinks, inebriated. That was the airline's word. And they'd been waiting a week and waiting to go home, wherever that was in the South, to just come home. And they were waiting in the San Francisco airport, wondering if the students were going to attack or the airlines was going to attack because they couldn't get a flight out. That was homecoming. And you've heard 1,000 stories, and there are probably at least 10 incredible stories here. But the point was that was homecoming, and that was traumatic. And I flipped out. It's the only time I remember, at least in public. I won't tell anybody the times I flipped out in private. That's my business. But I flipped out, and if I could have gotten to that girl after she told me this and said they would not be able to get on the plane, I tried to pull rank because I was still wearing my captain and my caduceus. I thought I had some kind of power. And they kept going, doctor, you don't understand it. And I said, I definitely understand. They're getting on an airplane. And it took the airport police, the San Francisco police, the FBI, whatever, to apprehend me, to get me off top of the counter as I was shouting down on this beautiful blue-eyed woman that I wish I could have met in different circumstances. And she probably still has nightmares about that. But to me, she represented America. And that was what lingered on when you hear about all this post-traumatic stress disorder. That the president talks about no more Vietnam syndrome, this, quote, syndrome, so you don't get caught up in this word, whatever the shit syndrome means, is all of these little stories built into human beings that had to suffer these things, that store this up, thinking, how do you get rid of this fucking syndrome? I got the syndrome, you know. So they finally took care of me because I was an officer and I was a doctor. So, hey, and they put me in and made sure that they had 2 flight attendants that were coming off duty that flew me all the way from San Francisco back to Birmingham, Alabama, so I would be okay. And these 2 guys got on the airplane, 2 out of 3,000. We took care of 2. You know, that's not bad. It's how I feel sometimes about my work, even though I've been doing this 20 years, you know. All the problems are fine, right, Larry? We're all fine. It's 20 years ago, whatever. But I remember that flight home, and I couldn't drink enough, and I was on morphine, legally, for my wounds, and I could still feel. I couldn't numb the feeling. I couldn't drink enough. I couldn't take enough medication, and I came home. And the journey now was, how do I get out of the sewer? And the sewer was like I was in it. And the journey took me from 5 months in a VA hospital to Los Angeles, California, looking for that integrity and someone to say, comfort me. And that was my buddies. I had 2 or 3 people that were in Vietnam with me that invited me out. And it sounded better than Mars. I couldn't get to Mars because that's where I felt like I belonged. I was a weird duck. I had my education behind me. That was almost, to me, I did no big deal. It was like, hey, what am I don't have anything to do. I can't go to school and deal with this syndrome. I'm a professional. I'm supposed to go out and get a job now and take care of people. And I'm pretty dirty. And I came out to L.A., and just as Walter was saying how he met me, I ran into the head of psychiatry at UCLA and the VA at that time at a cocktail party. Sort of juiced up with one of my sergeants who was in graduate school at USC. Hope that's not a dirty word here. But it was USC. And he kind of bit into some of my anger. He set me off. Not on purpose. Because most of the time people that set us off don't mean to do it on purpose. Just some innocent questions like, well, what are you going to do now? And we have these Vietnamese veterans with syndrome walking around all over L.A. We got hundreds of thousands of them. He offered me the opportunity, which really in a way saved my life because of my background or whatever, to make a difference and to work with Vietnam veterans now that were just recently from the war to deal with the woke syndrome. And here's a professional psychiatrist, internationally known, Dr. Philip May, who wrote the book in the 50s and 60s on what we now know as schizophrenia, who said, and get this, Larry, they're not schizophrenics. And whoever else is out there, and if John Price is here, they're not character disorders. And what are they? It's the syndrome. Somewhere, the syndrome. Felt like a trailer for a movie. The syndrome is coming. April 15th. I bet you'll be there. I didn't know when it was going to show up, but I hit the streets. And I wish you could have been in the car coming up today, because in a little bit I'm going to introduce someone that has had to live with a father who had the syndrome, whatever that is. And I got to really tell the story of the journey, which I don't have time to do today. But real briefly, I rolled my sleeves up once I decided to take on this impossible challenge, because it was about the only thing that could get close to the highs that I had in Vietnam, the challenge of flying in a chopper, which I had assigned to me, and I could fly anywhere. And it was pretty exhilarating. I had the opportunity to deal with anything and anybody. And believe me, being white with a southern accent and working whites is not the healthiest thing to do. And they tell me I still have a little of an accent, but you can imagine in the early 70s walking into Watts at Central City Bricks with about 20 combat black vets that feel like that the world has screwed them over since day one. And Vietnam was just the icing on the cake. And I learned a lot. I listened. And they shared stories. And I spent years, 7 or 8 years, listening, developing a forum called rap groups, which you've heard. That's how these vet centers operate. I didn't do it on purpose. It just became groups, and we rapped, and they talked about their war. It was safe because it was amongst brothers, and I invited sisters. It's the only one that brought women vets in. It was like they felt like they weren't vets because they didn't do combat. Well, honey, I didn't do combat, and I'm having it. I got the syndrome. And we started talking. And what happened is I used a lot of my clinical techniques that you do in group therapy, but it's still listening and getting it out. One thing you have to do with these wounds is to talk it out and share. You can't hold it in. It's like a pressure cooker. You'll explode. And believe me, over anywhere from 100 to 130,000 Vietnam vets exploded in the last 20 years inside and are no longer living because they exploded within themselves. And you explode. And that's just a warning to any of us or any veteran of any war, is to need to share and get it out. And if anything that happened through my innocent journey with whatever God gave me in sharing and running groups all through Los Angeles, and running into, by accident, like I ran into Walter, or he ran into me by accident, to the future director of the Veterans Administration, who was a triple amputee Vietnam veteran, Max Cleland, who was a good friend with old Jimmy Carter, who talked funnier than me, who became president of this country for a 4-year period, who on and on and on, basically, I was invited to talk to Congress in 1977. At the same time, just a few months after I met Walter, and it's so funny because Walter, in so many ways, and we have never shared this, and I don't know why I'm doing it, but he had asked me as if I had something to say. I knew what to do on the streets, but I didn't know I had anything to say to you folks. I mean, you don't have the syndrome. Do you have the syndrome? She doesn't have the syndrome, so why is this important? Why are we doing this class 12 years later? I mean, what is it? And what I realized is I did have something to share. And certain people wanted to listen. And for one peephole in my life, I had the President of the United States in Congress that, first of all, liked a freak show. You all like a freak show. You can admit it in private. We like to go to horror movies and be spooked or whatever. And I was real spooky in those days. This guy looks like a Marine corporal compared to how I looked on the streets. You should see pictures of me. And nothing, because I love this man. But I mean, he looked like he was ready to go on active duty. And I had to go to Congress, and they spent 3 months in acting school trimming my beard, cutting my hair, getting rid of all the paraphernalia, putting me on my first suit of my life, and working on my language. I spent more time getting rid of 4-letter words. And that's all I had to do. I already had the script. It was so bad I had to read my 5 minutes in front of the White House Commission on Mental Health. And after that 5 minutes was over, things happened. And it's because I shared. And I just told my story. And I was given the opportunity by Walter to share. And through that sharing process, people learned, because people got to hear from those that have been there. And that was the legacy that was so important. There have been many legacies in Vietnam. Many of you understand have parents that are Vietnam veterans. The legacy was our sharing. The sharing, particularly in '79 when the Iranian hostages came home and Vietnam vets finally got repulsed and said, they're getting a ticker tape parade, and they stood up. Well, that moment they stood up saved the Vet Center program, which was only a year old, that the White House was getting. The new White House said, we don't need this program. So you're always dealing with the shift. People change their mind. They don't know what they want. And what happened was I had the opportunity, and because of individuals like this, I shared, and look what it's done. And I haven't done it personally. It's just I was there, and I took the opportunity to share my feelings and to share the real stories, and not to horrify you, because if anything I want to do is to say from that journey came the National Vet Center program, which was a clone, a modification of what I had the only clinic in America in Los Angeles. And in my 7.5 years, almost 8 years on the streets, I only worked with 13,000 human beings. That's by myself. I mean, quote, I hold the record, whatever that means. And 350 women, Vietnam veterans. Some of them are better and some of them are dead today. But the fact is that a program was molded after that. Things like this class came on, which have gotten international, not just national, but international coverage. This class where you're sitting today, because of this man, because of this, all this energy and sharing bouncing off and relaying. And the Vet Center program took effect in '79, just 2 years after our meeting. Close to 1 million human beings, Vietnam veterans, families, and significant others have been treated through that program in the last 10, 11 years. And from that, we've learned the syndrome means something else. It means post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's a normal reaction to an abnormal situation that looks abnormal, and that's okay. You got it? A normal reaction to an abnormal situation that looks abnormal, but it's okay. And that's all we got. That was the syndrome. We cracked that. Just a few good people cracked that. And we found out, no, it's not schizophrenia. Dr. May, you were right back in '71, and we're not assholes, we're not character disorders. You got that? We have this. And you know what? World War II veterans had it. Civil War veterans had it. Every veteran has this trauma. It's a catastrophic event. So once again, we've shared something we found out we didn't know, that everybody in here has the opportunity of sharing in the syndrome of PTSD. And we know it just doesn't happen to veterans. It happens to rape victims, earthquake victims, airplane crash survivors, and survivors of other horrifying things, hostage survivors. And we've learned so much. There's been so much positive learned from this Vietnam War. Children have learned that their parents were Vietnam veterans. I've watched that happen 1,000 times in this class. Didn't even know mommy and daddy or one of them was a Vietnam veteran. And we've learned so much in the last few years that Desert Storm comes. And what happens? In '86, I left the Vet Center program. I left it to move on. There was another level, and that was to do other things besides just the counseling, because you got homeless vets now. Program couldn't deal with that. You got vets dying of Agent Orange. You got vets that are incarcerated, disproportionate number incarcerated. You still have no education and training. Even if we are in our 40s, a lot of them still have never been trained, educated. We still have a POW MIA issue that's never been dealt with, and that we're dealing with. There's actual movement going on to this day as POWs is this moment from this next war are coming home. My foundation is involved right now of bringing home a few individuals from Vietnam that you don't even know about, that every veteran in this room probably doesn't know about. That's what we're up to. That's what's come out of this Vietnam legacy. That's what's come out of this class. And what can come out of this class for you is the fact that you don't just listen, but you move on some of this. And I want to share a few things that you can do. First of all, you're having the opportunity of a lifetime with this current war that's come to an end, Desert Storm, to be involved. If anything Vietnam veterans didn't get, they didn't get a parade. That's going on. You've had a chance to support, which Vietnam veterans didn't have. That's another tremendous thing that came out of Vietnam. I'm proud of that. I'm happy about that. I'm not living in past. I'm still disappointed I didn't get a homecoming in the way I came home, but I'm so happy. I'm not that crazy that I would want it to happen to my worst enemy, and I think that's great. And I think the other thing is you have the opportunity not to forget your history and your legacy. because it could have been very different, this recent conflict. And many of you in here, if it's not going so perfect, could be in a situation very soon to go into a different status than you are now. And whether it be in the Saudi Arabian desert, whether it be in the Southeast Asia jungles, whether it be in Central America, whether it be along the Nile River, or whether it be in South Africa or anywhere else in the world, war is a no-win situation. There are no winners. And if anything you want to get today, and get it real good, is that no one, regardless of the fact that we have done extremely well, probably better than any war we've had, as short as it's been, get it that there are really no winners. And you watch a year, 2 years down the road, those that were involved in combat, those that were ready to go in combat. The gentleman here that's been sitting on ready to be mobilized with his unit that's over there to go over. There's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of stress. It changes your perspective on life. What we have in place through my foundation is a guarantee to America that not only am I still here and moving, but we're going to go beyond. And my foundation started in '86, got going in '87 through a big reunion concert through rock and roll, Doobie Brothers reunion concert at the Hollywood Bowl in '87. We got a little money. Since then, we've opened our charter as of August to Desert Shield to all veterans. We're not just Vietnam veterans. We're the Vietnam Veteran Experience. We can clear up any confusion about syndromes. We can clear up any confusion about who wins in war. And it's only a number. It's only, yes, the Kuwaitis have their country back, and the Saudi Arabians aren't going to get bombed. The Israelis not going to get bombed. But there's the people that were in the machinery are the ones that suffer. They suffer losses. They're not losers. You know, don't confuse the war with the warrior. Just to look at these men as they come home and watch the parade, and look at the individuals here that didn't get a parade, and remember, there's no difference. We were just as sophisticated in our war, in guerrilla warfare, as they are in desert warfare. It's just don't forget that it can happen. It happened once. The country's still living with that, but you can move on from that. You can also participate in organizations. Not just peace, but participate in veteran organizations. I want to enroll you in my foundation. I want to give you my 800 number and say, hey, I'm not asking for $1. If you want to give me $1 million or your folks want to, fine. But enroll yourself and somehow get involved. I think that the most important thing you can do is to do, not to listen. There's a time to listen. There's a time to take action. Separate yourself and distinguish yourself from most Americans that I've run into in this country that watch TV and get old. Don't watch TV and get old. Everything is balanced. Watch and listen and perform and act and do something. Get involved. There are individuals here that need your involvement. I need to be involved with you. I feel like I am today because I know you have more to share with me than I'll ever know at this level in your generation. And get involved with something that addresses this, because someday, whether you do it now or later when you have children, you will have to deal with this terrible thing called war. And you will have to deal with a personal war, because we have other wars. And you'll have to deal with a catastrophic event. And I think that is what you need. You have the opportunity to be prepared for. You know, it's like I've always said, and I said this in a 60-minute program I was on a few years ago, it's like the oil Fram commercial. It used to be this commercial on Fram oil filters. And it's very simple. And remember this, because I've used it for almost 20 years. And I'm sharing it with you to use. And just remember it, whether you want to just take it today with your automobile or take it with yourself. And that is, you can change your oil filter for a few pennies today, or you can change your engine in the future. You can pay now or pay later. How do you want to pay? And that's something you need to remember. And you need to also remember that it's very easy to be enrolled. I'm just down the highway. I'm always in contact physically, spiritually, and mentally with this program here. I'm so happy I was able to make it at the end. I apologize for having to cancel a few times. And in closing today, I'd like to do something that I haven't done. I'd like to show you and introduce to you a non-veteran and someone that came just from where you are a few years ago, not 3 or 4 years ago, who has enrolled herself. It's a woman non-veteran whose father was in Vietnam, and who for a few minutes would like to just sort of share the impact of being involved and the impact of what this is all about. And I'd like at this time to invite Terry Ann Steinhauer up just for a couple of minutes, and then we'll close after this. And I'd like for her to just share.
Thanks. Just to start off, I don't even know how to get up here and speak now after, this is really the first time that I've heard Shad speak in this arena. And I sit down here and I listen, and I see all these people here, and this is a story of my father. And it's very hard for me to keep my emotions out of this, so I will try. But my father was a surgeon in Da Nang, which is where Shad was in 1966 to 67. And I had the opportunity last June, to travel back to Vietnam with my father. And the way my father goes about healing himself is by helping medically in that country now. And so I had the opportunity to go back with my mother and my youngest brother and my father to Vietnam. And I spent 2 weeks in the country visiting all the hospitals and clinics. And I'd also like to say, I was 4 years old when my father went over there. So it's been a part of my life for as long as I can remember. And also my youngest brother, who's now 20 years old, was born without an esophagus, which was a very common birth defect in children of veterans who had been exposed to Agent Orange. So my brother suffered a very severe birth defect from the effects of Agent Orange. And I also have an uncle who was a fighter pilot who was shot down over Laos on Christmas Eve 1967 and was never found, so my uncle is MIA. And I knew all this stuff, but I never knew how it really had impacted my life until after I had traveled to Vietnam with my father and came back and contacted Shad, who I'd known for a few years. And I enrolled myself. Shad and the other people in the office invited me to enroll myself and participate with the foundation. And through this, it just completely blew open my life as to how it really had affected my family, and how my father has the syndrome, and how I never knew that, but my father's very established. He's a doctor and all this stuff, and I thought, no problem, I don't even think my dad realized how much it had affected him. And I can go on and talk. I mean, there's a zillion things I could tell you about how it's really affected my life, but the one point that I want to make is by my enrolling in this foundation and in this cause and in Shad's mission, which has now become a part of my mission, because I am the child of a Vietnam veteran. And I am just as much a part of this whole issue as Shad or any of these other people who served in Vietnam, even though I didn't serve in Vietnam, but it is a part of my life. It's a reality. And the biggest gift that this has been for me is when Shad talks about taking action, not just sitting back and listening, but through communication, through our knowledge, but through communication, you create reality. And what this has enabled me to do is communicate with my father and my mother, but with my father, and I have given him a place and I have created an opening for my father to communicate back to me, to start releasing all this stuff that he's been holding in for years and years and years, and not being able to really discuss it with my mother, because my mother went through her whole thing My mother had a son the month after my father left and raised a son for a year without my dad being there. And then, bam, my dad comes back and he's got this little boy in his life, plus these 2 little girls. And he comes out of this experience, you know, bam, right back into mainstream society and raising a family and this and that. And so everybody in my family has their own little stories. But the best thing for me is with my father, it has created an opportunity for me to share with my father and my father to share back with me, which in turn is a part of the healing. It's a process, and it's a beautiful process because really my relationship with my father has just blown open. With my family, it has been. And also through that, we have a national 800 number, and I get calls every day at the foundation from wives or children or veterans themselves saying, I need help. How can you help me? How can you help me? How can you help me? And to be in that position daily, to be able to help these people out and give them a phone number in their area around the country that I know, I mean, it's the most incredible gift, and it empowers you. It gives you so much power, and that's what I really want to get across to you all. If you enroll in whatever way, it will bring you so much power to be able to help somebody in need. And that's what our mission is about. And we invite you into our foundation and our mission to enroll and participate. So I've been rambling, but thank you.
Thank you. We've gone over here by a couple of minutes. I'm going to ask you to stay for 30 more seconds because I'd like to say something in response to all this. I was part of the second group that went to the Soviet Union, Vietnam veterans and other people went to the Soviet Union. We got off in the Moscow airport, and there were some people sort of huddled around the fence over there. I went over and talked to them. These are Russian Soviet vets from the war in Afghanistan, and one of them sort of mumbled something. And I said, what? I mean, I don't know what is in Russian, but what? And he was mumbling a little bit more, and what I heard him say was, Shad Mishad, Shad Mishad. He was looking for Shad Mishad. They were all down there because they were hoping that Shad would come. What I want to say to Shad is that I introduced him as co-founder of this course. He's come back to this class year after year after year. I don't think we've ever said welcome home to Shad Mishad. I'd like to do that right now. Welcome home.
There was a chapter in my book I wrote about my year in Vietnam several years ago, sort of a therapeutic thing. And I'll never forget our other good friend, Bill Mahidi, who you got to hear. And I wrote a chapter. It was a saying in Vietnam that goes, "It don't mean nothing." And it was a way of numbing yourself through this journey. And Marines, everybody said it. It don't mean nothing. If your best friend died, it don't mean nothing. You had to numb yourself. And I wrote that chapter, and I'll never forget, Bill Mahidi told me one day at my book publication party, he said, it do mean something. And believe me, being a part of this, and thank you for welcoming me home, it means a lot. Thank you.